Hey guys, Mr. Theorist here with another theory video. This theory video is the Super Legends of the flarrowverse, but mostly to do with the Flash and a little bit of Legends of Tomorrow. And how, in my theory is kind of be how they perceive time would work in the DCU. Because so far, I feel it's almost like they haven't quite laid down the ground rules properly, or they laid down the ground rule and then it almost feels like they contradict themselves. But after thinking about it, and taking on things that have happened all the way through the series, I believe they actually might have it actually in place. Mainly, this theory has spawned off from the Flash's Season 1 finale and Season 2 episode where Reverse Flash turns back up. What I mean by this is obviously the end of Season 1, spoilers in case you haven't seen Season 1 yet. When Eddie Thawne shoots himself, his descendant, Abod Thawne, the Reverse Flash, completely disintegrates from time. And yet the timeline of the TV series isn't changed at all. And then Abod Thawne then turns back up in Season 2, and it gives some convoluted reason as to how this had happened, even though with Eddie shooting himself, every Thawne post-Eddie shouldn't exist, because Eddie hasn't had kids, and every Thawne past him would cease to exist completely. So I've been thinking about it, and it puzzled me for quite a while, and I was like, TV show, you're not being consistent, you're not laying down exactly how time travel works. But actually they have. And I think it's quite clever, because they've given also the idea that time travel can work in two ways. There's natural time travel, which is a speedster tapping into the speed force, and then there's unnatural time travel, which is when somebody builds a time machine and uses that to travel through time. And we know they're two distinct ones because the repercussions from changing history is seen in different ways. You've got the speed wraiths go after speedsters that mess with time and basically erase them and kill them off. But then if you use a time machine to time travel, the time masters come after you. Now, I'm not quite sure how, I'm watching Legends and I'm not quite convinced on all the different rules and how time travel works with the time machine. But I think I kind of understand how the rules all work with a speedster time travelling. And that is that when you time travel, there are two ways it can happen. If you're going back in time and all you're doing is observing history, or making minute changes that wouldn't affect the timeline at all, you simply interact with yourself. You can talk to yourself, you don't become one with that timeline. But if you make significant changes to the timeline, or enough of a change that would change the course of history, you then are forced to then become part of that timeline. And this is shown twice, for both reasons, in both seasons. The first time we see the whole, you travel back, you change things, you become part of the timeline, is the episode where Barry first accidentally time travels and saves Joe's life. And from that point onwards, we continue on that timeline. And yet at the end of the season, when he goes back to save his mum, but doesn't, we see, instead of him merging like he did in the first time we time travelled, we see one version of him that's fighting Reverse Flash, and we see another version of him that tells him, no, do not interfere. But at first you're like, well, that maybe they're just changing the rules as the series is going along. They do the exact same thing in Season 2, where when Barry and Arrow are having a crossover and Vandal Savage staff blows up, and it basically disintegrates all of the Flarrow team, Barry travels back in time to stop them. And again, because he's changed history, we then watch the timeline continue from that point. And yet, later down the series, when he travels back in time to find out something about to find out how to become faster by Abod Thawne, evil Harrison Wells, when he travels back, he doesn't merge with a younger version of himself or with that timeline. He gets to interact with himself because he isn't making any changes. There's the really subtle change about Pied Piper becoming a good guy, but obviously, according to history in the timeline, that doesn't make that much of a significant difference. And yet, at the end of season 2, because he goes back and saves his mum, we then see, when he looks over at the version of himself that would essentially have been him at season 1, it fades away. Because Barry is now part of a new timeline where younger him never needed to travel back and think about saving his mum. Essentially creating what's known in the comic books and in the animated movie, the Flashpoint Paradox, where Barry is essentially stopping himself becoming the Flash by saving his mum. Obviously, I think the TV show will play it out differently, but that's kind of what Flashpoint Paradox was, and he has to try and get his powers back. But anyway, and it's because of the way they've shown us how time travel works, that I feel we have a concrete reason as to how, at the end of season 1, Eddie shoots himself and Abel Thorne gets erased from time, and yet Abel Thorne can also then reappear in season 2. And it's because Abel Thorne travels back in time to try and beat Barry, kills Barry's mum, but by killing Barry's mum, he's essentially changed history. Because originally there was just the timeline that Abel Thorne had where Barry's mum was alive. But by going back and killing Barry's mum, he's actually created a second timeline. I don't think he knew this, because the way he was making sure he's on the right path of his history is he was using the Gideon computer to look at the crisis. But I feel the crisis has nothing to do with him. He just knows the crisis will happen, and as long as the crisis still happens, he believes he's on the right track. But because he has made the significant change, he is then part of that new timeline, which then makes him the descendant of this Eddie Thorne. So then the whole series plays out, Eddie Thorne then shoots himself, and because in this version of time he is Eddie Thorne's descendant, he would then be erased because Eddie Thorne has stopped any future Thorne from being created. And yet, because even though the Abel Thorne was erased, he still exists on another timeline before he travels back. So the Abel Thorne we have in Series 2 that appears in a one-off episode is in the Flashpoint Paradox timeline and accidentally travels to this timeline. Not quite sure how, probably because he's so mad trying to destroy the Flash, he's zapping all the way across multiverses and probably different timelines and then goes, oh, bumps into this. But because he makes no significant changes to the timeline, and because technically there are no more Thorns now that he could be a descendant of, he simply appears, then disappears out, because he hasn't merged with it. And we see the examples of why Abel Thorne doesn't instantly be erased as soon as he's in the timeline, is because we've been told in Legends of Tomorrow that time takes, excuse the pun, time to solidify itself, to become history. Rip Hunter explains this, and we see this when in Legends of Tomorrow the team travel back in time and meet a younger version of one of the team members, Steins, and one of the team members knocks a younger version of him out, and because of this he might not ever marry his wife, so his wedding ring disappears. But then Rip Hunter makes sure the event still happens, so the wedding ring reappears. And I think that's kind of a slightly different altering way to what would happen with the Speedster. But essentially it's kind of like a new timeline's being formed, kind of not. But because it was still in flux, the ring disappeared then reappeared instead of like Steins never having memory of it at all. So yeah, I think that's what it is that Steins is technically on the same is from the same timeline as the TV series, but it's only because he wasn't until the events where he killed Barry's mum and then became part of it. And that way you can have it where, yeah, Steins like Abel Thorne will always kill Barry's mum, creating a new timeline and be erased from history. But younger him will still exist until that point. But on a different timeline, hence why he will always get to that point, because it's two separate timelines happening at different points, kind of same points. And as you can see, very wibbly wobbly, timey wimey. But I think if they just said that to us, that Abel Thorne was from a slightly different timeline to the one that the TV show currently has, that would have been better than the weird convoluted way they gave us in the TV show. But kind of the way they ended the Series 2 finale, that kind of confirms that notion, which I thought was quite cool. Anyway, I've been talking a while. I hope I haven't scrambled your brain with trying to explain all of this. If I haven't, please like. If I scrambled your brain or I've totally lost you, leave a comment. Or comment if you totally disagree with my theory and you managed to follow it all the way through. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!